Today, I'm going to take a look at the Chiefs' visual identity, dive into the history of some Chiefs' past logo designs, and even take a crack at making a new logo myself. This is a logo for the Kansas City Chiefs. It's remained largely unchanged since it was launched in 1963. First introduced as a helmet design, and then eventually it became the primary logo in 1972. So the logo itself was designed by Lamar Hunt, the owner of the team. He was the one who moved the team from Dallas to Kansas City. He was heavily influenced by the San Francisco 49ers logo, which is, obvious if you look at it now. The primary thing that I think about when I see this mark is the slab serif typography and the KC monogram. So when we're talking about slab serif, we're talking about these flourishes at the end of the letters, which in a slab serif are squared off. In a serif typeface, i.e. Times New Roman, they tend to be sharper. They're a little more decorative. In a slab serif, they're much more bold, impactful, blockier. That's kind of like the defining characteristic of the typeface. Or in the case of a sans serif, you have none of the above. It just ends with a flat edge. So aside from the specifics about the type style, the thing that's interesting to me about the dimensionality is that it's not necessarily correct. It doesn't make optical sense necessarily, the way the shadow is coming off of the C in this area versus the more straightforward shadow that is just coming off of this area in the K. They just feel a little bit, disconnected from how it would appear in real life, which is fine. It has a little bit of that naivete. It feels hand-drawn, and then at some point it was digitized, and there's a certain kind of character that comes with that, but I would say that's an area of opportunity as we start to think about what we can do with it. You have the actual arrowhead shape. As much as that could be refined, I understand why they did that. It adds kind of like a human quality to it, and obviously reflects kind of like the roughness of the edge of these arrowheads themselves. Over the years, certain things have become inconsistent with it or treated in different ways depending on where it lives. So in this case, you're seeing the logo as it largely stands on the helmet. It might feature a logo with a white outline around it. What you are looking at here is the closed C version, which has a flat bottom. There is an open C version where the C comes out a little bit and it gets cut off without the flat edge. That is something that even to this day, there is an open C on the helmets, but does not exist anywhere else. So for example, we have this helmet from 1971, this helmet from 2024. Interestingly, you can see that they both use the open C. The primary logo, however, since 1972 has been the closed C logo. It wasn't necessarily drawn this way because of, rounds and rounds and rounds of revisions and putting it through the lens of what kind of like a corporate brand identity needs to accomplish. It was more for the spirit of it. And I think that adds to the character and frankly, what people love about it. So I think that this exercise in and of itself is probably gonna ruffle some feathers because there's an idea of how logos have that kind of built-in imperfection, and that makes it what you know and you love. So I think that for me, part of the challenge of this is you don't want to ruin that spirit, but you instead want to think, what can you do to, add to it? So from 1960 to 62, the Dallas Texans. This was the original iteration of the team. The mascot itself was drawn by someone who apparently worked for a local newspaper in Dallas as a cartoonist. Interesting to look at it now because it feels a little folksy and just less rigid than what we think about as sports logos, but this is pretty common if you look at old baseball teams, old football teams. So the main two elements, obviously you've got your cowboy, state of Texas, and then he's holding a football. Beyond that, there's not much of a story to be told here. It's pretty straightforward. Feels a little more like something that could just be for any local sports team. Also, to be clear, the NFL didn't even exist at the time of this. The Dallas Texans played in the AFL, which merged with the NFL's former version in 1970, thanks in part to Lamar Hunt. So one thing you will notice is the color. Even though the logo itself has nothing to do with what's happening now in 2025, color has remained largely unchanged, with red being the dominant color. From 1963 to 1971, After the team moves to Kansas City, this is a logo that they end up with. It's an evolution, obviously, from when they were in Dallas. The same artist had drawn the logo for Lamar Hunt. It wasn't clear that they were going to be called the Chiefs at the time. Lamar had actually pitched to call them the Kansas City Texans, and was talked out of that by a member of his team. The name, the Chiefs, came from the mayor of Kansas City at the time, who they called the Chief. With that, they ended up going with this mascot. So for a variety of reasons, this would not fly today. Teams much like the Washington Commanders, the Cleveland Guardians, they've all had to contend with this. When they moved to Kansas City, it's a little bit funny. Now, part of it is the orientation of the city. Rather than just picking Missouri, much like they went with Texas here, they have kind of like a mess of about, 6 states behind the logo. And with that, obviously they have their mascot in the axe, who have the beginnings of what you could say is something that's going to evolve eventually into the arrowhead that we know now. And then aside from that, one other dominant feature of this you can see is still you have your red color and you have your gold. The gold did evolve a little bit over time, became brighter, but the red obviously was still the anchor point. Okay, and then in here, you have the beginnings of what we'll call a monogram. Monogram is a collection of letters that overlap, generally speaking, and build kind of like a unique symbol based on those letter forms. Here you have the beginnings of the KC that will evolve into the logo that we know now. So that's logo history. We touched briefly on the Commanders, but I think we should take a minute to look at how they dealt with a similar challenge. So in 2022, this is the identity that the Commanders came up with. For a variety of obvious reasons, they needed to change the name. I mean, look, these are very complicated conversations. I'm sure there was a lot of deliberation. They ended up landing on the Commanders, which built the base for kind of what I would say is like a strong identity. However, an identity that really just, to me, it lacks a cultural anchor. The way that this W was translated into kind of like a larger type system, it feels modern. Maybe you could say there's some forward momentum here. It's based in this idea of a stencil typeface, much like when you have to spray paint initials onto something. I have my own personal issues with stenciling type. I think sometimes it's a little bit of a cliche and it can just fall into this kind of attempt to make something feel iconic and feel unique, but again, it's not really saying anything. But just to circle back on what I think they were really anchoring this in, the color. So we've taken a look at a recent rebrand that maybe fell a little bit short. What I'd like to do now is take a look at one that I think anchors itself in history well and was executed perfectly. So this was done in 2024 by House Industries. House is undoubtedly the masters of, a lot of different things, adding character to typography and figuring out how to take the bones of something and make it work the best that it can. A notable, element of the way the Kings logo has worked for a long time is the slanted lettering. They decreased the amount that it was italicized and they reworked all of these lines that were coming off the letters. They made the letters feel a little bit bolder. They rebuilt this lettering to make it all tie together. And then with the crown, this was an update to an existing crown that existed in an old logo. So the logo on a whole was only undertaken because they did a throwback jersey that had a vintage brand mark on it. And it ended up being so well loved that they ended up using that now moving forward. I think it's time for us to start our rebrand. So I think the logo overall could benefit from a little more room. This area just gets totally swallowed up and you lose all sense of dimension. You lose the kind of where the K and the C are coming together. The approach, in my opinion, is not the full-scale rebrand, but really to think about what's working with the logo right now. What do people love? Tighten up some of the inconsistencies that had crept in over the years. How does that then extend out into a larger brand world that brings in the marketing and all the other pieces of the brand on a whole? Same as the last episode when we were working on the clippers, the goal here isn't to build the perfect proportions right now. I'm just trying to give myself a starting point so that I understand what I'm trying to accomplish when I get to the computer. Sometimes that's math, sometimes that's eyeballing it and having to optically correct things so that they feel right more than they measure correctly. Lettering is more of an art form than a science. I mean, it's a little bit of both, but I would say more so than a lot of graphic design. The actual drawing of the letter forms is something that often is imperfect. The next step from here will be going on a little bit of a typeface hunt to try to find something that works not just for this mark, but also, you know, how does that apply to the larger Chiefs brand system? Right now, the Chiefs word mark is something that has this 70s pastiche, I would say. And the Arrowhead Stadium mark follows a similar type style as a Chiefs word mark, but feels oddly different. So what you end up with is it's a brand, but it's just a collection of a bunch of different ideas that somehow feel disparate and not as linked together as they could be. Not perfect, but for me, that's the basic framework for how I want to approach the KC. Now, the other consideration and where we'll probably move from here, the relationship of this mark to the arrowhead shape. Then we'll go from there onto the computer. The existing arrowhead meets the edges of the letter forms on both sides. The biggest area of opportunity for me is just trying to open it up, give a little more breathing room around the K and the C, protecting the monogram a little bit more. Again, this is not totally perfect, but I think this gives me a good starting point to understand sort of like the basic relationship of where I want to take the monogram within the arrowhead shape. Let's get it into the computer. This book is the photo lettering one-line manual of styles. This serves as a way to navigate all of the different typeface families that are a part of the photo lettering family. Photo Lettering Inc. is the name of a company that was founded in New York City I believe it was founded in the 60s. Even though this is way pre-computer, I still use it as a way to navigate and wrap my head around just what the possibilities are within each of these different type families. These start to get a little too expressive, a little too condensed, and you can see it starts to get a little too fancy, a little too flourished, and we're looking for something that's more straightforward and a little bit more like brutal in how geometric it is. So I think this is a good reference for the style of about what we're looking for. We're not going to be able to get this exact piece of type, but there is a type foundry by the name of Commercial Type that has done a really good job of sort of like finding these historical references and updating them. And I believe that they have one that I could work with, Antique number 6. You can see there, like stylistically, it's pretty close because they don't offer an extended weight of this. What I'd have to do is use this as a framework, but then I can kind of like, you know, adjust it and rebuild the letter, but use this as the bones. The slab serifs are a little longer than I need them to be. That's an easy adjustment to make, but the proportion in how the joints of these letters are working is actually exactly what I'm looking for. Let's see. The bold gets a little too dense, so I'm going to stick with the medium. Potentially sacrilegious in terms of typesetting here, but basically what I'm going to do is I am just going to stretch the type out. Generally speaking, you would never really want to stretch the typography either vertically or horizontally because the proportions of those letters, again, going back to what I was saying about type design being an art form, those are built with extremely specific nuances in mind. But when it comes to what we're doing here, it's really just giving me the proportional width that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to have to go into the individual letters and not redraw them, but adjust them so that they work the way I need them to. Now here, this is a super important part, is I want to make sure that I'm opening up that interior so that when I have my C crossing through, that it has enough space to breathe. As far as I'm concerned, one of the things that is not really necessary in this exercise is to be worrying about the basic colors of the team. I don't think that has anything to do with any issues that we have here. Simple stroke on it. So the way that I'm gonna try to build the shadow in this one, which is gonna be different than the way the shadow is drawn in on the existing logo, is I'm gonna build it just true based on actual math so that every angle of the shadow can follow the exact same dimensions. Okay, I'm feeling good about where we're at with the KC monogram. Let's move on to the arrowhead shape. Rather than just draw one out of thin air, what I wanted to try to do was just find an image that I could use as a starting shape. All right, so the edges on this one are gonna be a mess. Now what I'm gonna do as well is, even just while I'm sketching it out, I'm gonna throw it on the red background because I think The logo very rarely just appears on a white background, and I don't want to be judging how this is working without taking that into account. My gut is that the primary use case of this logo should be with the white outline. The way it appears on the helmet, I can understand why they wouldn't do that. It keeps it somehow simpler, but at the same time, this gives me an opportunity to play with the outline around the letters, as well as the outline that holds the arrowhead shape and how those can have a relationship to each other. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. There's still some more work that I'm gonna keep doing to that one, but I think for now, we got a good thing to start as a base for the rest of the letters. One thing that I love about the way that this type family works is that the different weights sort of have a different vibe. And I think, one way to have a complementary word mark without going to the extreme that the current word mark has, where it's an entirely different family, entirely different sort of aesthetic, is to just lean into the heavier weights of this, which give a little bit of like a different flavor. Now, I think for the purposes of this, though, I want it to be a little deeper. I want more of a shadow on it because I'm imagining this living, in the end zone, maybe somewhere in the uniform, but I wanted to, have a little bit of like a stronger base. The main thing I would say about the Chiefs jerseys, there's actually relatively little branding. For me, the yellow around the numbers gets lost. And then there's this more current jersey that includes the little tribute patch for Lamar Hunt. And even though these jerseys are 2 decades apart, they largely are exactly the same. How do we want to approach the numbers? How do we want to approach any other inclusion of branding? I think that's where we can start to have some fun. The main challenge for me is going to be to figure out one other way to bring in brand recognition into the uniforms. The existing Kansas City Chiefs uniforms look really good, but I think that if we're going to go through all this trouble of trying to bring the word mark into this world, think about different ways that we can use color. I think that there is an opportunity to maybe do something on the helmet, including play with a color stripe, which is something that some teams play with, but Kansas City just has classically not done so. One thing that I would push overall is for the jerseys just to feel a little bit somehow simpler. Right now, there's a lot of different color blocking happening, the way that the red and the white, and there's just like some contrast issues. And I think that when I look at the palette, it feels like if things flattened out a little bit more and just became a little more like specifically red dominant across the board, it might just help to simplify things a little bit. Taking some liberties here. Now for the number, I'm staying a little more traditional varsity style. Outline in black, which is a little bit weird because it makes it stand out, but I like the idea of the contrast of that tying back to the KC logo, and then a little bit more reduced in where the yellow color comes in, because I think that too much of that, and it just kind of like, to me, it throws it off a little bit. I think staying a little more red dominant makes for just like a newer look. To recap the things that were fixed here, we get a lot less of the mark getting swallowed up and losing the space within, but then also around the KC. Tried to even out the strokes within the letter forms. As the mark reduces, gets smaller on the field, you don't lose kind of like the definition of the letter forms in the monogram in the middle. So the other thing I wanted to do is bring consistency to the word marks. I really like the way that this Chiefs mark goes back and speaks to the logo and where we're ending up. I like that the shadow operates in the same angle and with the same treatment. It has its own kind of like necessary depth, so it does have its own little touch, which was the goal. One thing also that the Chiefs' current identity does not include is a lockup with Kansas City. This is by no means final, but I think that the type family that we're choosing here really creates an opportunity to create a consistent treatment as a way of kind of like instilling some pride in place. One other little Easter egg that I liked is that the C in this typeface has that same sort of openness from the helmet logo as it exists right now. So even if we were to go in and update the logo, I like that this mark maintains a little bit of that kind of like historical nod and reference. With the exact same style of the Chiefs word mark, I think you could very easily just bring the arrowhead brand into the same family as everything else. So rather than having this sort of like disparate kit of parts where everything feels somehow disconnected from each other, I think that there is a real opportunity to bring all this stuff into the same place from the same brand language and tie it all together. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and let us know what team you want us to take a look at next.